Okay, I think that we will start. Apologies to everyone for the link mess up. Don't know what happened there, but we'll try to sort it out and figure out so it doesn't happen again. We could just welcome everyone to Turning the Tide on Climate. Last week we talked about youth and climate activism, and tonight it's the Green New Deal. I'm Clark Mackey, as you probably already know, and Jude will be the co-host tonight, reading from the chat, where you will write your questions and comments to the presenter. As usual, we're recording this, and the YouTube link will be up on the 350 website. And as usual, we're going to just take a minute to think about where we are situated. And acknowledge the fact of settler colonialism in the past and in the present, and how it relates to climate change. Kingston is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee territory. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kyla Tienhaara, who has spent a lot of time researching and thinking about the Green New Deal. She is the Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment at the School of Environmental Studies and the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's. Prior to Queen's, she held positions as a research fellow at the Australian National University and as the head for research for Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Her most recent book explores the lessons learned from green stimulus programs in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Welcome, Kyla.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks for putting together this fantastic series, and for inviting me to participate in it. I'm really incredibly impressed at the number of people that you've been able to pull out. I remember when Clark first approached me about whether he thought that you should do a series, I was like, oh, you know, people are zoomed out. They're not going to be up for yet another seminar. But I'm really pleased to see how well this series has been going. It goes to show just how engaged people in Kingston are about climate change, which is wonderful to see. And hopefully, if you haven't heard of the Green New Deal before, then I can convince you that this is something that you should get involved and engage with tonight. So I imagine that many of you may have at least had a sort of some kind of passing experience with the Green New Deal, but perhaps you haven't heard much more about it than that Tucker Carlson from Fox News thinks that it is somehow responsible for the tragic situation that the people in Texas found themselves a few weeks ago. So my aim in the next 15 to 20 minutes is to really just give a very quick primer on what the Green New Deal actually is, and dispel a few common myths about it, and also address some of the legitimate critiques that have been made about it. And if anyone wants to discuss more specifically why Tucker Carlson is an idiot, then we can get to that in the Q&A. All right, so let's dive right in here with what is the Green New Deal. So the first point I really want to make is that it isn't a single policy or plan. So a lot of people talk about it in terms of being a package of policies. I like to think of it in terms of it's a way of framing the discussion and about the ecological crisis, about climate change, which emphasizes that we can tackle decarbonization of the economy and inequality at the same time. And by inequality, I mean economic inequality as well as racial and gender inequality. Another key aspect of the way that the Green New Deal frames the response to the ecological crisis is that it really de-emphasizes the role of private industry and market mechanisms like carbon pricing, and it has instead government playing a really central role. So this doesn't mean that the Green New Deal rejects carbon taxes per se. They certainly can have a role, but it's more of a rejection of what has been viewed as kind of an over-reliance on this type of mechanism and other market mechanisms. So rather than assuming that the private sector is going to lead the transition to a low carbon economy, the Green New Deal really sees government as needing to directly intervene in the economy. This can be, of course, through public investment. So this is where the whole discussion about green stimulus comes in. But there are also more radical elements, such as proposals for governments to provide a job guarantee. So this would mean that basically the government would provide a good paid job to anyone who wanted one, doing things like, for example, ecological restoration. So the role of governments really distinguishes the Green New Deal from other proposals to green the economy, because most of those other proposals are really focused on pricing environmental externalities like pollution and possibly providing some incentives like subsidies to green technology firms. But that really sort of, in my mind, can just be a sort of a greening of neoliberalism. It's not a complete sort of rethink. Whereas a Green New Deal really embraces more of a stronger Keynesian model, like the welfare state, but green, or even some cases more of an eco-socialist approach. And so that I really want to emphasize that government aspect, it makes it different from other green economy approaches. So when I first came across the Green New Deal back in 2009, it was in a report from a UK-based Green New Deal group. They put out this report just before the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, which of course kind of was the sort of kickoff for the global financial crisis. And I ended up sort of being really, I got so interested in this area that I ended up spending the next 7 years studying the green stimulus measures that governments adopted in the wake of that crisis. I was initially very excited about this whole idea of killing two birds with one stone, and it seemed really like it was potentially a watershed moment for breaking that jobs versus environment kind of axiom that has been such a barrier to progress on climate change and other ecological issues. But of course, I ended up quite disappointed. Not a lot of progress was made as a result of the stimulus. However, I did still learn some lessons about what kind of investments worked and what kind didn't, which is again relevant at this moment as governments around the world are trying to reboot their economies. And it is also sort of relevant when we talk about the public investment side of a Green New Deal. I would say this is sort of a generalization. Context is very important. The devil is in the details, all that kind of stuff. But based on my experience, if I was going to be evaluating a green recovery plan or a Green New Deal, I would be really happy to see investments in home retrofits, especially if they're targeted to low-income households, renewables, especially if they're targeted to small-scale and community-based projects, public transit, and things like research and development. On the other hand, I would be concerned to see investments in carbon capture and storage, which we saw a lot of back in 2008, 2009, nuclear power, car trade-in, cash for clunker type schemes, and also energy efficient product rebate schemes. I'm happy to go into all of that in more detail if you want to in the Q&A, but that's just sort of a quick overview of maybe some of the things that we could see investments in and some of the things that maybe we should stay away from. But it's really also important to think beyond where money should be invested and think about the bigger kind of structural changes that we can make to our economy. And in that respect, I really think that we need to get away from the idea that green jobs just means renewable energy, the renewable energy sector, like putting solar panels on roofs or planting trees and things like that. Education, healthcare, elder care, childcare, the arts, these are all really low carbon but high public value jobs that we should invest in more. And I think that's something that the Green New Deal discourse really embraces. Another one of my sort of pet interests is why can't we share the jobs around a bit more? There's plenty of evidence that after a certain level of income, people don't get any happier with more money, and that actually what we would all like more of is time with friends, time with family, time for leisure activities and volunteer work. I think a lot of these things have sort of come out in the midst of this crisis that, you know, we can all still buy stuff on the internet, but what we all really long for is to be able to, you know, be in a room together again, rather than meeting over Zoom. There's also a direct link between this type of thing, this working time and the environment. So commuting has an environmental cost. And also when we're time stressed, I think we tend to consume more wastefully. And there's lots of interesting research on how a shorter working week could be good for the environment and could form part of a Green New Deal. All right, so those are some ideas about what a Green New Deal could include. I want to just sort of move now to maybe some of the things about what a Green New Deal isn't. So what are the kind of myths that are floating around out there about the Green New Deal? A real bugbear for me is when people tell me that we shouldn't talk about the Green New Deal in Canada because it's an American thing. So first of all, statements to this effect are usually accompanied by some kind of anti-American sentiment to the effect that Canadians shouldn't emulate American policies. I think that's kind of funny because often the people that say this are also the first ones to suggest that, oh, Trump's lowered corporate taxes, so we should too, type of thing. But putting aside that and putting aside the fact that we shouldn't really care where good ideas come from, as long as they're good ideas, the truth of the matter is that the Green New Deal is not an American idea. So I totally give Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey, who are pictured here, and the Sunrise Movement. If you're talking about, youth climate action last week, then you would know probably about the Sunrise Movement. I give them a lot of credit for popularizing the term, and also sort of I think emphasizing the inequality aspects of what they wanted to tackle. But I consider the founders, as I said, of the idea to be that Green New Deal group in the UK, which came out with this idea back in 2007, 2008. But also the United Nations Environment Program proposed a global Green New Deal in 2009. Korea had a Green New Deal in 2009, although I would admittedly say that it was not a particularly good Green New Deal. I studied it and there was a lot of greenwashing that went on. But the current government is also working on a Green New Deal, and that one I have hopes that it might actually be much better. Here in Canada, the NDP MP Peter Julian put forward a Green New Deal motion, and there's also a very broad coalition of NGOs that support the idea of a Green New Deal in Canada. So it's not an American thing. A second myth or a misconception about the Green New Deal is that we can't afford it. So a right-wing think tank that gets funding from the fossil fuel industry put out a report in the US that the Green New Deal proposal that was launched by Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey would cost 93 trillion US. So this is pretty ridiculous because the proposal that Ocasio-Cortez and Markey put out was 14 pages long, and it didn't have a lot of specifics in it. So it was very speculative to try to cost it. But the other thing was that one of the big ticket items in it was offering universal healthcare, which is obviously a significant thing in the United States, but not as applicable in other contexts like Canada, where we already have universal healthcare. So this is a ridiculous number. It's been fact checked and found to be false. But putting that aside, it is true that a proper transformative Green New Deal is not going to be cheap. So that raises the question about where should the money come from? How do we pay for it? There are a number of different ways that people answer this question. A lot of people have turned to what's called modern monetary theory, or MMT. I want to be very clear at the outset that I am not an expert on MMT. I only really sort of vaguely understand it at the moment, but I still think it's important for everybody here to be aware that this is something that exists and is discussed in the context of the Green New Deal. So the basic premise behind this is that we shouldn't think about governments having to balance budgets in the same way that households do. Because in countries like Canada, where the government has sovereign control over its currency, it can actually afford to pay for whatever it wants to. It can't run out of money, it can't go bankrupt. This sort of raises the specter of the idea of governments printing money, and then you start worrying about hyperinflation and those sorts of things. But basically, proponents of MMT argue that taxation and other tools are sufficient to control inflation. And this isn't just a theory; it's also something. It's basically people are arguing this is what's happening right now. This is what governments are doing in terms of responding to COVID. They are creating money, and it is, the world hasn't ended. And also in the case of other crises such as World War II, governments did the same thing. So here the argument comes that if we actually treat climate change like the crisis that it is, we shouldn't worry about how much it's going to cost. We can afford it. So if you're interested in understanding this better, there is a very popular book out at the moment by Stephanie Kelton called The Deficit Myth. I think I haven't read it yet, but it's on my summer reading list. Apparently she's very good at sort of breaking down these arguments and making them very clear. Okay, but even if you aren't convinced by MMT, and lots of people aren't, lots of people dispute it, there are other ways that we can pay for the Green New Deal. Removing fossil fuel subsidies, I think, would be a fantastic one, would free up a couple $2 billion right there. Obviously, we could also not spend the $12 billion plus on the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. And ending these subsidies would have benefits beyond paying for the Green New Deal. So it's a win-win. Same thing with taxing the wealthy. They consume way more resources and produce way more greenhouse gases than the rest of us. So again, it would be a win-win. If you didn't want to tax wealth, we could also just decide to tax luxuries like air travel. But I think more generally, when we're talking about the cost of the Green New Deal, we should not forget that not acting to address climate change will cost us way more. I lived in Australia for 10 years, and even though a year has passed since this photo was taken, it still really breaks my heart to look at it. The cost to that country from those bushfires is immense, and those kinds of costs are only going to grow and be for people all over the world. All right, so the final myth that I want to address tonight, and perhaps if judging by recent events that I've participated in, perhaps the most controversial one, is that embedding proposals for decarbonization into a broader plan for addressing issues of inequality and injustice is somehow going to overburden climate policy and will actually delay greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the argument that like climate policy is hard enough. Why do we want to like put all this other stuff on it as well that it'll just bog us down? So my first response to those that would argue along these lines would be, oh, really? So you think that the approach that we've been taking so far has really worked and we should just stick to that? And I would go back to this slide and suggest maybe we ought to try something different. Secondly, I would say you need to look at these issues a bit more deeply. And if you do, I think you'll start to see the connections. Inequality and climate change are deeply intertwined issues. The rich cause the most damage and the poorest suffer the worst consequences. So here you can see the poorest half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people, is responsible for just 10% of carbon emissions, while the richest 10% are responsible for about half of greenhouse gases. And the wealthiest 1% uses 175 more times more carbon than one in the bottom 10%. And then thirdly, I would suggest that we actually have a better chance of winning if we can bring more people into the climate tent, right? So we have a better chance of doing that if we can make the issue relevant to them. So it's great to see so many people on this call, but I still recognize that a lot of people out there don't care as much as I do about climate change. This is not because they're bad people. This is not because they're uneducated, but because they have to care about immediate concerns that I don't have. So, you know, things like, can they pay rent this month? Or how are they going to pay for childcare or medical bills? So if they see a Green New Deal as not just about some sort of far off future or about people in other countries who are suffering, but about addressing the concerns that they have here and now, then I think they're more likely to want to be involved. And if the communities that are going to lose jobs in the transition away from fossil fuels also see that there's a place for them in a Green New Deal, then perhaps the grip of the fossil fuel industry over politics in places like Alberta will also begin to loosen. So I think that, you know, this is actually a winning strategy. So I have focused mainly on the critiques of the Green New Deal that I don't think are valid, but I do want to briefly mention two that require a bit more thought and attention. The first is that much of the discussion of the Green New Deal is framed in terms of it being a national program, and that tends to ignore how that national program might impact other countries, particularly those in the global south. So a lot of emphasis on creating green jobs revolves around the idea of like returning manufacturing jobs to the north, or things like relocalizing agriculture. And that's all great, except where does it leave those who have structured their entire economies to produce commodities and products for us in the global north? Also, we can't ignore the fact that renewable energy technologies require extraction of things like rare earth metals, and that often occurs in places where there's poor oversight of human rights and environmental protection. So the countries in the global south also need a Green New Deal. However, they don't have that sovereign control over their currency, so they can't just sort of, generate money. They've usually got currencies that are pegged to other ones, like the US dollar. So MMT theory maybe doesn't apply as well there. So increasingly, there's a discussion about how we can make a Green New Deal truly global. I think that's going to require really an overhaul of international economic institutions, as well as redistribution of wealth through things like reparations for colonialism or some other form of transfer. If you're interested in these particular issues, there's actually a book launch this Thursday on this subject, organized by the LEAP, and the details are available on a website that I'm going to share at the end of this presentation. The last critique I want to mention is that the Green New Deal often doesn't, people who are proposing it often don't address head on the issue of perpetual economic growth and whether that is possible within planetary boundaries, which I think people are increasingly accepting it's not. And so this hasn't really been addressed head on much yet, but that doesn't mean it can't be. The Green New Deal is fundamentally about decarbonization and reducing inequality, and neither of those objectives are inherently require economic growth. So there's some really good ideas that are coming out now from scholars in the degrowth movement about how to merge their ideas into a Green New Deal. So things like the shorter working week that I mentioned earlier, universal basic income, universal basic services, those are the kind of ideas that are sort of being talked about now. And I think that Green New Deal proponents are pretty receptive to those ideas. So I think that's a promising area. So I am going to stop rattling on there and we can get into the discussion. But thank you so much for coming and for your attention. And if you are interested in learning more about the Green New Deal, I haven't really launched it yet, but I have a website that I'm working on that's basically provides a lot of links to different resources. So be aware that it's a work in progress, but feel free to check it out. And you will find the link to that book launch on Thursday afternoon that's organized by the LEAP. And yeah, otherwise, if you have questions after tonight, also feel free to send them by email. And I'll share that website in the chat too. So I'm just going to stop sharing here.
Great, thank you. That was fantastic. It looks to me like there's quite a few questions in the chat. I'm gonna start off with one, and it's the very last point that you made. I guess what seems to be, in my looking at all of this, it seems to me that we really do have to ratchet down consumption if we're going to get anywhere. And if we do that, it does mean that the economy is not going to grow. It's not. And when I looked at the conventional ideas that education, childcare, elder care, healthcare, the arts, those things are paid for by economic activity, by the taxation on economic activity. But if economic activity goes down, where is that money going to come from? I guess could you just talk a little bit more about that and about the degrowth question?
Yeah, so definitely sort of a tricky topic in terms of, where does the money come from? Again, MMT people would say, you don't need to tax in order to spend, you can create money. But I think the other thing to think about in terms of degrowth is like, some areas of the economy can shrink and others can grow. I mean, you can have growth in things like the arts and childcare and so forth without an increase in carbon, because those are sort of low impact. But I think that at the end of the day, we also have to, if we're thinking about reducing consumption, then we have to just kind of switch our mindset around in terms of where we want money going in the economy. So it's not that we're going to go back to, if you accept degrowth, it's not about setting yourself back to living in caves or whatever, but there have to be ideas about sufficiency in terms of energy use rather than just efficiency. But I think that the overall picture is one where if we are working less, we are still going to be happier. I mean, in terms of how do you pay for childcare and things like that, I don't know if I have sort of an immediate answer other than that MMT would suggest that you don't need to bring in more money in taxation in order to spend, but you can also other levers that I was talking about in terms of taxing wealth, extreme wealth more, taxing corporations more, taxing luxuries more, and taking that money and devoting it to public services.
Yeah,
Does that answer that question?
Yes, I mean, I would just say that there's a lot of money sitting in banks, right? That the very rich have exorbitant amounts of money. I mean, I think the Apple Corporation has more money than the government of the United States, for example.
Yeah,
heard that somewhere. So
I mean, Jeff Bezos. I mean, if we just took a fraction of his money, and the bank's question is interesting too, because again, I'm not an expert on finance, but one of the lead authors of the Green New Deal group report in the UK is writing a chapter for a book that I'm editing on the Green New Deal, and she's really focused on, and the Green New Deal group in the UK really focused on this as well, is that we need to sort of really clamp down on the financialization of everything, and we need to really regulate the financial sector much better, and that's also another way of sort of bringing money and control over money back into the public realm and away from all this sort of private hoarding. But yeah, again, there's so many pieces to it. So I didn't emphasize the financial stuff, but there is definitely a piece of the Green New Deal there as well.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I think that, as I say, there are a lot of questions, and so I'm going to pass it over to Jude Larkin now, who's going to read some of the questions from the chat.
Okay, so our first question is, can you say a few words about Roosevelt's New Deal? How closely is the GND based on the ND?
So I wouldn't call myself a historian, but the New Deal did definitely have some interesting elements in terms of green programs, but also I think more generally the flavor of the New Deal being based on sort of Keynesian policies and monetary as well as fiscal. So there's another thing that this author Ann Pettifor sort of emphasizes, is that everybody thinks of Keynes as being very much in terms of just the fiscal side, in terms of government spending money, but the monetary picture is very important as well. So I would say that it is definitely inspired very much by the Rooseveltian New Deal. That's the Green New Deal group in the UK took a lot of inspiration from that, and in turn, the Sunrise Movement and AOC sort of, in a weird way, kind of learned something from the UK group that was back to sort of American history. But the original New Deal, while it did have some programs that could sort of be considered environmental, the Civilian Conservation Corps was responsible for planting a huge number of trees and creating sort of the modern American park system. It was also criticized at the time by ecologists for the fact that the program sort of had a lot of monoculture in terms of the trees that were planted, and sort of didn't stick to really sound ecological principles. And obviously parks involved parking lots and intruding into natural areas and so forth. So even back then, the first green stimulus programs were controversial, and you see that still happening now. But generally speaking, I would say that there is a lot of inspiration that is drawn from the original New Deal, and also just the sort of ethos that we've done this before, we've had these kind of big challenges before, and we've been able to respond. And I think that's, I don't know if anyone has come across Seth Klein's book about the good war. He really takes inspiration from this idea that, you know, we faced crises like this in the past, so it's not beyond our capacity to overcome them. And in that way, the New Deal really provides a lot of inspiration. I don't know if that really answers the question, but
Yeah, no, thank you. The next question is, can you talk more about the role of degrowth / steady state in a Green New Deal?
So this is sort of a fairly recent thing. I would say that the initial proposals, like the AOC Markey proposal, and I mean, there's a Green Deal in Europe, but it's been sort of heavily criticized as not really being a Green New Deal. And certainly the Korean Green New Deal, none of them have really addressed the degrowth or growth issue. I think part of that is to do with the fact that it's still seen to be really politically touchy to go after growth. I mean, there's a lot of academic discussion about why we can't have perpetual economic growth on a finite planet. Actually, you know, this discussion's really been around since the 1970s at least, but it's always been one of those areas that it's very hard for policymakers to see how to get around, you know, growth being a goal, that GDP is sort of fixed in their mindset as being equivalent to progress, and also as the only way to sort of create jobs. If the economy is not growing, then you assume that jobs are not being created. A job guarantee really fits very naturally, though, with a degrowth kind of framework, because again, you don't have to rely on the economy to grow in order for everyone to have full employment. And the fact that the Green New Deal really focuses on employment rather than growth, I think is important in terms of melding them. But having said that, it hasn't really come out in official sort of policy proposals. It's just starting to be more discussed between scholars. So there's an article by Giorgio Callas and Jason Hickel, who are two pretty prominent degrowth scholars. Again, you can find that in the library of my Green New Deal website. So that basically says, here's the Green New Deal as a proposal, here's degrowth, how can we sort of merge the two? And the ideas in terms of how to do that is definitely job guarantee, but also considering things like shorter working week and other sort of universal basic income type proposals.
How does a job guarantee work?
So again, not my exact area of expertise, but the basics of it is that the government just agrees that it's going to provide a job for anyone that wants one, and then it's up to the government to sort of come up with the projects that they want to employ people in. So, like I said, with the New Deal, there was a civilian conservation corps that put all these young men mostly to work planting trees and developing parks. There's a lot of discussion in the present context about the amount of ecological restoration that we need to do. So if you were going to look, for example, if you're talking about the need for a just transition in Alberta, there's a huge amount of cleanup required from all of the operations in the tar sands. And while in an optimal world, the companies that were responsible for creating the mess would be also responsible for cleaning it up, the reality is in a lot of cases that companies manage to get off scot-free and leave without having actually cleaned up the mess. So same thing in other countries. In Australia, where I lived for quite a long time, there's a huge number of mines that have been sort of just abandoned after companies have gone bankrupt or just sold to smaller companies that then don't have the money to pay for the reclamation work. So there is potential for a lot of people to be employed in ecological restoration and cleanup.
And this feeds into the next question. Well, do you see a green basic livable income as part of a Green New Deal?
Yeah, so I think that's something that's definitely discussed. I haven't come down on whether I think providing basic universal services or basic universal income is better. If there's anyone on the call that has opinions on that, it'd be great to hear. But that's definitely something that could be a part of a Green New Deal. I think it's again one of those things that was discussed before COVID, but now is much more out there in the public frame, because obviously governments are providing some kind of wage supplements, but a lot of people are suggesting, well, first of all, why can't we just always do that? But also suggesting that it would be a better and fairer system to do it in as universal basic income instead of something like CERB. So I definitely think that could be a part of a Green New Deal package, but I don't know whether the best approach is the basic income or providing basic services so that everyone has access to childcare. I mean, I think universal basic childcare should probably be a part of a Green New Deal, even if there is also universal basic income. But there could be other services that could be provided in that kind of package.
Next question is, have you considered carbon or energy rationing?
I haven't done research on this, but I do think it's a fascinating concept. So there's two approaches to dealing with things like flying and so forth, which again, something that I think a lot of academics have had to grapple with over the past year, thinking about our carbon footprints for what we would usually be doing instead of zooming would be flying all over the place. So you can either take an approach where you should tax things like air travel so that they're much more expensive and therefore people are likely to do less of them. But the argument against that, I guess, is that means that the wealthiest are still going to be able to, and it's only going to really hurt the lower income brackets. So rationing would be a sort of fair way to allocate that type of thing, where people would only be permitted to fly once every several years or something like that. I see that there could be a lot of difficulties with implementing a program like that. But again, take it back to the wartime example that Seth Klein talks about. There was a lot of rationing that went on for that crisis. So if we do start to accept climate crisis is the crisis that it is, then perhaps it will become more acceptable to take on things like rationing.
The next question, while reading reparation theory, it clarifies how one of the easiest ways to make reparations, whether they are cultural or ecological, is to stop doing that which creates harm. How does the Green New Deal address this?
So the Green New Deal is about stopping doing harm in terms of, keeping fossil fuels in the ground and stopping climate change. So that's stopping a type of harm. But in terms of other forms of harm, I think that there's a recognition that Indigenous people need to be definitely at the center of a Green New Deal. And in places like Canada, I don't think a Green New Deal would be complete if we didn't address things like providing actual clean drinking water to communities that still don't have it. Amazingly, in a country that is developed, there are communities without access to clean drinking water. It depends on what harms you mean, but I would hope that by addressing inequality through either providing programs, universal programs, or actually stopping harms in terms of climate change and other forms of ecological harm, which disproportionately impact people in Indigenous communities and also certain racial groups. So those kind of environmental injustices, I think, will have to be addressed in a Green New Deal. But again, comes down to the devil being in the details in terms of all these programs. What I've given you is very like a big broad overview of what people hope to see in a Green New Deal. Actually netting out the specifics is a ton of work and requires a ton of experts. So I would expect to see a broad range of people consulted on what should be in the Green New Deal, and that would include Indigenous peoples as well as other groups that are traditionally marginalized, to make sure that the programs are going to make life better for them rather than worse.
Thank you. And what are your thoughts about Hickel and less is more?
So I'm a big fan of Jason Hickel. Again, I have this book sitting on my iPad waiting for me to have time to read it, but I am familiar with his other work, and I am generally quite a big fan. Degrowth is one of those things where I was always like, yeah, that makes sense, but how on earth are we ever going to convince people that this is the way to go? But I think increasingly people are more receptive to those types of ideas. I think, again, this crisis has caused a lot of people to rethink the way that we live and whether we actually do want to return to normal when it ends, if it does end. And I think the sort of ideas that are being put forward very very eloquently and forcefully by people like Jason Hickel about how we can flourish and actually have a better life if we sort of change the focus of what we are working towards, away from overconsumption and towards the things that actually matter. So I think it's quite convincing, and I hope that seemingly the popularity of the concepts that he's putting forward are increasing, and so hopefully it's more and more likely that these kind of policies will become a reality at some point.
Next question: what would small-scale community renewables look like?
So all these are great questions, but a Green New Deal covers so many things, and so I know a lot of people that do great work on community renewables, and there are a lot of different models that are out there in terms of the specific kind of legal contracts and things like that. But the basic thing for me is that I don't want to see us just switch from fossil fuels, big corporate fossil fuels, to big corporate renewables. I think that opposition to renewable energy usually comes from the fact that communities don't feel like they've been properly consulted, that they don't feel like they're benefiting. And also just, I think that, with this whole, degrowth idea, the idea should be that projects should be scaled to the local context and should fit with the local context. Because people, I think people should reconnect with, not just with the land, but also with the resources they use, like energy. And the reason why I don't just want big renewables is because, and why I think degrowth is important is because, first of all, getting the amounts of ever increasing amounts of energy from renewable energy means encroaching on land in order to put up solar farms or to put up wind turbines. It also means going out and extracting a lot of resources. It means creating waste. I mean, wind turbines don't last forever. I was amazed when I went to visit the Wolf Island farm that, at some point in not too distant future, all those wind turbines will just come down and that will be waste. So just because we all want to switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy doesn't mean that we don't have to think about everything that goes into also creating renewable energy. So I think that the community-based renewables just means it's it's scaled appropriate to the local context, and that the people who live there, sort of are involved in it and benefit from it, and see it as part of their community rather than something that's sort of imposed on them by a corporation that's just making money and just interested in it for those reasons.
So I'm just going to cut in here for a minute because in 2 weeks, we're going to have a whole Monday night on precisely this issue.
Great. So somebody with more expertise than me can talk about it.
Yeah, it's David McDonald.
Oh, great. So yeah, my colleague.
Yeah.
He's fantastic. So that'll be good.
Well, here's another corporation question. How can the destructive forest industry be retooled to respond to the industry continues to harvest more aggressively?
Sorry, can you just repeat that first bit again?
How can the destructive forest industry be retooled to respond to the GND concept?
So forestry, again, this comes back to ideas about the same sort of ideas about sort of communities and doing more with less, and as Hickel says, and so forth. So obviously, forest products continue to be important even as we move to a Green New Deal, but there's a need to do more in terms of replanting trees. I don't buy into the whole we can address climate change primarily just by planting trees. I think the most important thing is to first of all stop putting carbon dioxide into the air, but planting trees definitely has a role. So maybe we can retool people that work in the forestry industry to spend more time on actually recovering forests and not just monocultures that can be cut down. And that that can also be something that's that involves the job guarantee. But in terms of how do we break from the sort of big corporate domination of all of the sectors that affect the environment, I think at the end of the day, we need to be stronger in terms of regulating. And part of that also fits into the global economic institutions picture that I briefly mentioned, and which is where majority of my previous, my PhD and my previous research was on one particular institution, which is investment law and investment arbitration, which is a mechanism that I think we could really easily get rid of, but it's currently sort of the most glaring example for me of how corporations have come to dominate and to have much more power than governments in some cases. So you may not be aware that actually right now Canada is being sued under the old North American Free Trade Agreement for phasing out coal in Alberta and for deciding to compensate some of the power companies that were going to transition to non-coal power, whereas there was an American mining company that mined for coal and can no longer sort of provide coal to those coal power plants that's now arguing that it should be compensated. And there's actually a growing number of these cases around the world where anytime you sort of regulate a company in a way that it's going to potentially lose a lot of money, it's able to use this international system, legal system, in order to demand compensation from the government. So the Keystone XL pipeline also might end up being one of those cases. There's some coal power plants in the Netherlands that are bringing cases. There's also lots of cases where Canadian mining companies have done this to other countries around the world. The trading system is also, the World Trade Organization is also a system that needs reform in this respect. So yeah, it sounds like, sort of a cop-out to just say we need to regulate more and we need to change all these economic institutions. But I think that's at the end of the day, the only way to start sort of breaking down corporate power. And then we could get into all the stuff about how we need to change our democratic systems so that, corporations don't have so much power in terms of lobbying, and they don't have the revolving door where they go to work in government and then go to work as lobbyists and go to work in corporations. there's a lot of moving parts. So
Okay. Could we build an economy based on services rather than things?
to some extent, a lot of our economy already is based on services, but what we've done is kind of, I think, export all of the things and the creating things and the pollution associated with creating things to other countries. That's had detrimental effects in terms of people that had those jobs creating things in places like the US and Canada lost their jobs because they were sort of offshored to places where labor is cheaper. And the pollution was also offshored. And so this is another one of my bugbears, that people are always like, what about China when they talk about climate change? Like, what we do doesn't matter. What about China? A lot of the emissions that China is generating is just making things for us to consume. So I think the services economy still has an underlying sort of impact. And I mean, I guess it depends on the services. There are also things like, Bitcoin doesn't sound like it is environmentally damaging, but actually it seems to have a bigger carbon footprint than a lot of countries now. So I think, we can obviously build an economy based on more public services and more things that are low carbon but high value to people. But I also think we need to take that sort of, we don't need to keep having that service economy grow bigger and bigger and bigger either. We need to sort of scale back our expectations, because consumption still occurs regardless of where the production occurs.
Interesting. Okay, there's a couple more questions. Do we have time for a couple more, Clark?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Kyla, do you think a Green New Deal works with a capitalist, i.e. profit-focused economy?
I think that's like the number one sort of hardest question to answer. Yeah, probably not. But I think we can debate all night whether. So there's actually this debate is actually occurring right now, because how am I forgetting his name? Noam Chomsky. How can I forget Noam Chomsky's name? Has sort of been criticized by a lot of people on the left, because he sort of worked on this book with Robert Pollin about the Green New Deal, and it takes much more of a we can green capitalism. Capitalism is not perfect, but we can do a Green New Deal within capitalism kind of approach. And he basically said, like, look, I get it. Capitalism is bad. We want to get rid of it eventually, but we have like 10 years to really get on this climate change thing. So let's not focus, on necessarily dismantling capitalism. We need to make sure that we can still exist long enough to actually get to that. And I see the logic there. And then on the other side, there's people that are just like, but you can't possibly actually address all of these systemic structural problems unless you address the capitalist profit motive. And I know it sounds like a cop-out, but I am kind of still torn between these two positions. And ultimately, I guess I just sort of try to push forward the ideas that I can about the Green New Deal sort of being a really positive message about how we can actually have a better future coming out of tackling climate change, rather than the constant sort of negative picture that I think we often get. And that's the thing I really love about the Green New Deal. And I sort of try to just somehow keep these two sort of debates going in my mind. I know that's not a good answer, but I just haven't figured it out yet.
A work in progress for all of us.
Yeah, I'm constantly learning. So I definitely don't have all the answers, but these are all great questions.
Yeah, they're great questions. Yeah, here's the last one. I think I see the need for a simple book, perhaps even a child's book, to explain these issues in simpler language that will reach the non-academic community. Does such a thing exist?
Yes, amazingly. So Naomi Klein just published a book. Again, I haven't read it, but it is specifically targeted towards kids, and I imagine that it is. Very much in the vein of all these things that we've been talking about, because she's written a book on the Green New Deal, and she's been very vocal in sort of pushing forward this kind of framing. There is also a book that I do have that I bought for my 8-year-old daughter, which is it's an Usborne book. Uh, Usborne's a sort of kids book. They do a lot of great kids books, but this one is called I think it's Children's Guide to the Climate Crisis or something like that. But it's fairly recent as well. And I've had a flip through it, and it really does quite an incredible job of getting into all of this, the science, but also all of these kind of more social economic issues. So anyone with kids out there, there is, and actually they are good for adults as well, because they really do simply explain a lot of really complex issues. So I would definitely suggest that.
Oh, well, thank you very much. You talked about concepts that I had never even heard of, like a service economy. So thank you very much. I'll hand it back to Clark.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla. That was terrific. I see that there are even a couple more questions in there, but I think what we're going to do, we're going to close it up because we have a couple more things to do here tonight. The people who have asked, who at the very end there, maybe they could email you if they have further questions. So I'm just going to share my screen again, and we're just going to talk about, actually, I'm going to invite Julie Salter-Keene to come on for just a minute and talk about the this carbon or climate leadership plan questionnaire. Julie, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity tonight to raise the awareness about the climate leadership plan that the City of Kingston, working with our stakeholders, both the residents and the businesses, are developing, and it will be complete by the end of this year. And I wanted to raise the awareness and invite all those on the Zoom call today that if you live in the City of Kingston, to participate in 2 surveys, well, 1 survey if you're a business and 1 survey if you're residents, or 2 if you're both, that we launched a couple weeks ago. So in order to better understand the sort of climate actions residents and businesses would like to take, the city has opened these 2 surveys on our Get Involved page. The website is there on the slide. And the surveys aim to uncover barriers community members may face when it comes to reducing their carbon footprint at home, at work, or on the road. And then the input that we receive will identify the climate actions in the climate leadership plan. The survey will take approximately 10 minutes to do. And as I said, it's open till March 16th. And I invite you all to participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then just very briefly, next week, we have Dr. Marcus Taylor talking about climate justice. So this is your chance to find out a little bit more about how climate change is actually affecting countries in other parts of the world. So we look forward to seeing all of you then. So have a good rest of the evening, everyone.